When the head of the FBI sits before Congress and can't recall the names that haunt every American, something has gone terribly wrong. This wasn't just another political hearing where talking points clash and nothing gets resolved. This was different. A sitting congresswoman had to remind the nation's top law enforcement official about Charleston, about Pittsburgh, about El Paso and Buffalo. These weren't footnotes in history. They were massacres that tore through communities, left families shattered, and exposed an ugly truth about hate in America that refuses to die.
Lady from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director, for coming here today. And actually, thank you for your response to my colleague from New York who asked you earlier about violent extremism. And you said that there is violent extreme ideology on both sides. And I think you actually alluded to that same statement yesterday in the Senate. So I too have some questions I'd like to ask you. These are not gotcha questions, and just deny, please, what you deem to be false. So Dylan Roof, who followed white supremacist propaganda, murdered 9 black parishioners in Charleston in 2015. Do you deny this?
I'm sorry. Dylan Ruth? Roof, can you give me some more information?
You're head of the FBI, you probably know this. If you don't know, that's fine.
You can give me a reminder. I've got a lot in front of me.
It was national news. Robert Bowers murdered 11 Jewish worshipers in Pittsburgh in 2018.
I do remember that.
And it was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack. So do you admit that that happened?
I'm not saying the other thing didn't happen. I'm just asking for a little information.
Patrick Cruces, who posted a manifesto about a Hispanic invasion, walked into a Walmart in El Paso, Texas in 2019 and began firing. He murdered 23 people that day, and the youngest was 15. Do you admit or deny that that happened?
I'll take your presentation as accurate.
All right, well, I have to say all of these cases have been adjudicated. As I said, they are not gotcha questions. These incidents were national news. And as director of the FBI, you have access to all of this information. So in 2022, Peyton Grendon walked into a supermarket in a black neighborhood in Buffalo, New York, and started shooting. He murdered 10 people that day. And on September 10th, your friend Charlie Kirk was assassinated. Tyler Robinson has been taken into custody and charged, but also on that day, Desmond Holley, a 16-year-old white male, shot and injured 2 students at a high school in Colorado before killing himself. And according to the Anti-Defamation League, he had a fascination with mass shootings and white supremacy. So do you admit to, deny these facts?
Those happened.
Okay. Your predecessor, former FBI Director Christopher Wray, said that one of the most dangerous concerns is that racially motivated violent extremism, especially white supremacists, has been the biggest chunk of our domestic terrorism cases and is responsible for the most lethal attacks over the last decade. Do you admit or deny, A, that he said this?
I'll let the record reflect that. Whatever he said was what he said.
All right, and do you agree?
That there is racially motivated crimes being committed in America, yes.
Yes, especially white supremacists, which is the biggest chunk of our domestic terrorism. I'm glad that you said this. So last week, President Trump was asked if there were extremists on both the left and the right. He was actually asked this by Fox and Friends, and his exact words were, "I'll tell you something that's going to get me in trouble, but I couldn't care less. The radicals on the right oftentimes are radical because they don't want to see crime. The radicals on the left are the problem, and they're vicious, and they're horrible, and they're politically savvy." Do you agree with the president?
I don't speak for the president. The president speaks for himself.
Do you agree with the president?
I don't. On what matter?
On the question that I just asked, do you agree with his statement about the radical left?
That there's ideology that's driving violence on both sides? Yes, that's what he acknowledged.
No, he didn't. He didn't. Okay. But I'm glad that you're saying that and actually creating some separation between you and the president. And I'm glad that you are acknowledging that there is violent extremism on both sides. What's interesting is that the research arm of the Department of Justice, the National Institute of Justice, do you know what that is?
I'm familiar with them.
Okay, great. It is the research arm of the Department of Justice, and it published an article in 2024 devoted to domestic radicalization, violent extremism, and terrorism. I have it. It's interesting that it's no longer on the website. It has been scrubbed, but I ask these questions because what makes a strong, qualified director of any business, of any household, of the FBI, what makes a reputable prosecutor is not lapdog loyalty, but a commitment to the creed that evidence is agnostic and that the evidence will lead you to making the right decisions. And your job, no one's job is to like the data or the evidence, it is to collect it. That is how you gain trust. And Mr. Chair, I would like to enter into the record, if I may. White supremacist group stands by racist ideology with unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Dylan Roof, the radicalization of the alt-right and ritualized racial violence.
Without objection.
Thank you. Another article, how Robert Bowers went from conservative to white nationalist. I'd like to enter that into the record with me.
Without objection.
Patrick Cruces believed he was fulfilling Trump's wishes in El Paso attack, his attorneys said. I'd like to enter into the record.
Without objection.
Buffalo shooting, how far-right killers are radicalized online. I'd like to enter that into the record.
Without objection.
Evergreen High School shooters' online activity reveals fascination with mass shootings, white supremacy. I'd like to enter that into the record.
Without objection.
Murder and extremism in the United States in 2024, a report by the Anti-Defamation League. I'd like to enter that into
Without
the record.
objection.
And the article, the report that was scrubbed from the DOJ just recently, the National Institute of Justice Journal focusing on domestic radicalization, violent extremism, and terrorism. I'd like to enter that into the record.
Without objection.
And lastly, the libertarian think tank Cato and their analysis on violent extremism and the right rising in extremist acts. I'd like to enter that into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Representative Sidney Kamlager Dove from California walked into that hearing room with a mission. Her tone stayed measured, almost conversational, but every word landed like a hammer. She didn't come to grandstand. She came to get answers from FBI Director Kash Patel, and what unfolded left viewers across the country stunned. The exchange started simply enough. She thanked him for acknowledging that violent extremism exists on both sides of the political spectrum. Then she dove straight into the heart of the matter with a series of questions that should have been easy for any FBI director to answer. Dylan Roof. The name should be seared into the memory of anyone tracking domestic terrorism. In June 2015, this young white man walked into Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina during Bible study. He sat with the congregation for nearly an hour, listening to scripture, surrounded by welcoming faces. Then he opened fire. 9 people died that night. State Senator Clementa Pinckney, Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tywanza Sanders, Daniel Simmons, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, and Myra Thompson. All gunned down because of the color of their skin. Roof had posted a racist manifesto online. He posed with Confederate flags. His motivation was crystal clear, documented in his own words. He wanted to start a race war. When Kamlager Dove asked Director Patel about Dylan Roof, his response stopped the room cold. "I'm sorry, can you give me some more information?" he said. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the agency responsible for tracking domestic terrorism, needed a reminder about Charleston, about one of the most infamous hate crimes in modern American history. The disbelief was palpable. This wasn't some obscure case buried in FBI archives. Every major news outlet covered it. The trial lasted weeks. President Obama delivered the eulogy at Pinckney's funeral. The massacre sparked nationwide conversations about racism, gun violence, and the Confederate flag. Yet here sat the FBI director, drawing a blank. Kamlager Dove didn't lose her composure. She moved to the next name, Robert Bowers. October 27, 2018, Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Bowers walked into 3 congregations gathered for Shabbat morning services and unleashed hell. 11 people were murdered that day. Joyce Feenberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil and David Rosenthal, Bernice and Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, and Irving Younger. 6 others were wounded. 4 police officers were shot trying to stop him. This was the deadliest attack on Jewish people in United States history. Bowers had spent months online, consuming white nationalist content, ranting about a supposed invasion of immigrants. He blamed Jewish organizations like HIAS for helping refugees. Minutes before the attack, he posted on a far-right social media platform, High-ass likes to bring invaders in that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. When asked about Pittsburgh, Patel at least acknowledged he remembered it. But the hesitation was there, the uncertainty. For something that should have been immediate, automatic knowledge for the person running the FBI, there was a pause, a gap where there should have been instant recognition. The congresswoman pressed forward. She wasn't done. Patrick Crusius, August 3rd, 2019, El Paso, Texas. A Walmart packed with weekend shoppers, many of them Latino families from both sides of the border. Crusius drove over 600 miles from his home near Dallas specifically to target this location. Why El Paso? Because it was a border city with a large Hispanic population. He wanted to stop what he called the Hispanic invasion of Texas. He posted a manifesto online minutes before the attack, echoing the same replacement theory rhetoric that had inspired the Christchurch mosque shooter in New Zealand months earlier. 23 people died that morning. Men, women, children. The youngest was 15 years old. Jordan and Andre Anchondo died shielding their 2-month-old baby. Arturo Benavides was shopping with his wife when he was shot. Maria Flores was buying school supplies for her grandchildren. Crusius fired approximately 90 rounds. He methodically moved through the store, targeting people who looked Hispanic. 22 others were wounded, some critically. One victim, Guillermo Garcia, would die 9 months later from his injuries, never recovering from what Crusius had done to him. When police arrested Crusius, he told them he had been targeting Mexicans. He wanted to scare them into leaving the country. His own words. His own admission. A hate crime so blatant, so documented, there was no room for interpretation. Patel's response to Kamlager Dove's question about El Paso? I'll take your presentation as accurate. Not a confirmation. Not an acknowledgement of the well-known facts. Just a passive acceptance of what she was telling him. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Then came Buffalo. Peyton Gendron. May 14, 2022. Another Walmart? This time in a predominantly black neighborhood on the east side of Buffalo, New York. Gendron was 18 years old, radicalized online through white supremacist forums and manifestos. He spent months planning the attack, even traveling to Buffalo twice before to scout the location and count how many black people would be there. He wanted maximum casualties. He wore tactical gear, carried an AR-15 style rifle with a racial slur scrawled on it, and live-streamed the entire massacre. 10 people were killed. Celestine Chaney, Roberta Drury, Andre McNeil, Catherine Massey, Marcus Morrison, Hayward Patterson, Aaron Salter Jr., Geraldine Talley, Ruth Whitfield, and Pearl Young. 3 others were injured. Salter was a retired Buffalo police officer working as a security guard. He fired at Gendron, trying to stop him, but the shooter's body armor protected him. Gendron shot him dead and kept going. He moved through the store systematically, shooting only black victims, passing by white shoppers. When he left a note for his parents, he wrote that he was doing this for the future of the white race. During his state trial, Gendron pleaded guilty to domestic terrorism motivated by hate, becoming the first person in New York history convicted of that charge. In federal court, prosecutors are seeking the death penalty. Each name Kamlager Dove listed was another wound reopened, another reminder of communities torn apart by ideology-driven violence. And with each one, the FBI director's responses ranged from vague to forgetful to carefully non-committal. This wasn't about politics in that moment. It was about whether the person responsible for protecting Americans from domestic terrorism actually knew the history of that terrorism, whether he understood the scope of the threat, whether he was paying attention. The congresswoman wasn't relying on opinion or speculation. She came armed with facts, case files, convictions. Every attack she mentioned had been prosecuted. Every killer had either pleaded guilty or been convicted. The evidence existed. The families still mourned. The survivors still carried scars. These were not disputed events. She pointed out something that former FBI Director Christopher Wray had testified to before Congress, that racially motivated violent extremism, particularly from white supremacists, had been responsible for the most lethal attacks over the past decade. That this wasn't a both sides issue when you looked at the actual data. That one specific ideology had been driving the majority of deadly domestic terror incidents in the United States. Wray's own words, spoken when he held the same position Patel now occupies. Kamlager Dove asked Patel directly if he agreed with that assessment. His answer danced around the question. Yes, there's violent extremism on different sides, he acknowledged. But he wouldn't directly confirm what his predecessor had stated, what the data showed, what the prosecutions proved. The evasiveness was deliberate. Then she dropped another bombshell. A 2024 article from the National Institute of Justice, the research arm of the Department of Justice itself, had focused on domestic radicalization, violent extremism, and terrorism. It compiled data, analyzed trends, provided evidence-based conclusions. And now it was gone. Scrubbed from the DOJ website, disappeared. Why would the Justice Department remove its own research on domestic terrorism? Who made that decision? What were they trying to hide, or more accurately, what were they trying to avoid acknowledging? The timing was suspicious. The implications were darker. If the data contradicts the preferred narrative, make the data vanish. If the facts are politically inconvenient, pretend they don't exist. This brings us to the man sitting across from Kamlager Dove, struggling to remember or acknowledge these attacks. Kash Patel became FBI director in February 2025 after one of the narrowest confirmation votes in the Bureau's history. He had never been an FBI agent. He had no experience in law enforcement at the federal level. What he did have was loyalty to Donald Trump, demonstrated through years of service in various Trump administration roles. Patel wrote children's books featuring a character named King Donald, fighting against villains meant to represent Trump's perceived enemies. He spoke openly about wanting to prosecute journalists and political opponents. Democrats warned during his confirmation hearings that he would politicize the FBI, that he would use the agency as a weapon rather than a shield. Within weeks of taking office, mass firings swept through the Bureau. Agents and officials deemed insufficiently loyal were pushed out. Fear spread through the ranks. The concern wasn't theoretical anymore. It was happening in real time. An institution that had maintained at least some independence was being reshaped into something else, something more personal, more political. And here was the result, sitting in front of Congress, unable or unwilling to engage honestly with the reality of domestic terrorism in America. Because acknowledging that reality meant confronting uncomfortable truths. It meant admitting that white supremacist violence is not a fringe problem, that it's not overblown by the media or exaggerated by activists, that it's the single most lethal form of domestic terrorism in the country, backed by FBI data, DOJ research, and dozens of prosecuted cases. The hearing exposed more than just one man's forgetfulness or evasiveness. It revealed a system actively choosing what to see and what to ignore. When Kamlager Dove asked Patel if he agreed that racially motivated crimes were being committed, especially by white supremacists, he gave the bare minimum acknowledgement necessary. Yes, such crimes exist, but he wouldn't go further. He wouldn't affirm what the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated, because doing so would anger certain political constituencies. It would contradict the narrative that left-wing extremism is the real threat, that Antifa and progressives are the ones Americans should fear. Never mind that the body count tells a different story. Never mind that synagogues and churches and supermarkets have been turned into crime scenes by people motivated by the same racist ideology, using the same rhetoric, following the same pattern of online radicalization. Kamlager Dove ended her questioning by entering document after document into the congressional record. Reports from the Anti-Defamation League showing the rise in white supremacist violence. Analysis from the Libertarian Cato Institute, confirming right-wing extremism as the dominant domestic terror threat. Articles tracing the radicalization of each killer she had named. The scrubbed DOJ study on domestic extremism. She made sure the facts were preserved, officially documented, immune to future denial or revision. Because if there's one thing this hearing proved, it's that truth requires protection. That evidence needs to be locked down, made permanent, before someone decides it's politically expedient to make it disappear. What made Kamlager Dove's questioning so powerful wasn't theatrics or emotion, though the weight of what she was discussing was crushing. It was precision. It was the refusal to accept deflection. It was the insistence on facts, in a room where facts had become negotiable. She laid out a timeline of terror, name by name, city by city, victim by victim. She showed that these weren't isolated incidents, but a pattern, a movement, an ideology that keeps producing killers while those in power pretend not to notice. At one point during the exchange, she said something that should be engraved on every government building. Evidence is agnostic. Truth doesn't pick sides. Data doesn't care about political convenience. Facts exist whether we acknowledge them or not. The only question is whether leadership has the courage to face them. That's what was missing from Patel's responses. Not information. He has access to every file, every report, every piece of intelligence the FBI possesses. What was missing was the willingness to speak plainly about what that information shows. To say out loud that white supremacist terrorism is real, is deadly, and is the most significant domestic terror threat we face. To commit the FBI, publicly and unequivocally, to combating it with the same intensity it brings to other forms of extremism. His hesitation, his forgetfulness, his careful phrasing, all of it communicated a different message. One that extremists heard loud and clear: we're not really worried about you. We're not going to call you what you are. We might forget your name, forget your crimes, forget the people you killed. And in that forgetting, you're granted permission to continue, because this is an ancient history. These attacks didn't happen decades ago. Charleston was 9 years ago. Pittsburgh, 6. And Paso, 5. Buffalo happened just 2.5 years before this hearing. The families are still in therapy. The communities are still healing. The survivors still have nightmares. And the ideology that motivated every single attack is still online, still spreading, still radicalizing young men who see themselves as heroes, defending their race against an imaginary invasion. The next Dylan Roof is reading manifestos right now. The next Patrick Crusius is stockpiling ammunition. The next Peyton Gendron is scouting locations. And the FBI director responsible for stopping them can't remember the last ones. The statistics back up everything Kamlager Dove said. The Anti-Defamation League's Center on Extremism tracks domestic terrorism incidents and produces annual reports. Their data consistently shows that right-wing extremists, particularly white supremacists, are responsible for the majority of domestic terror plots and attacks. The CSIS Transnational Threats Project analyzed over 25 years of terrorist incidents and found that right-wing attacks outnumber left-wing attacks significantly. Even the FBI's own internal assessments, the ones that sometimes get leaked or disclosed in other hearings, confirm the same thing. This isn't a close call. This isn't a both sides have a point situation. One form of extremism is killing more people, more frequently, with more planning and more explicit ideological motivation. And it's the one that certain political leaders don't want to talk about. Why? Because the rhetoric used by these killers shows up in mainstream political discourse. The invasion language that Crusius used in his manifesto, that's been said by elected officials describing immigration. The replacement theory that motivated both the Pittsburgh and Buffalo shooters, that's been discussed on cable news shows, framed as a legitimate demographic concern rather than a racist conspiracy theory. When the president or members of Congress use language that echoes what's written in terrorist manifestos, how do you combat that terrorism without implicating powerful people? You can't. So you don't. You equivocate. You change the subject. You forget the names of the victims. You scrub the research that makes the connection too obvious. This is what makes Sidney Kamlager Dove's intervention so crucial. She refused to let that forgetting happen. She forced those facts onto the record, into the hearing transcript, into the public consciousness. She made it impossible for anyone watching to claim ignorance. Yes, there are people who will still deny it, who will insist that Antifa or Black Lives Matter or whoever the current bogeyman is represents the real threat, but they'll have to deny it in the face of names, dates, locations, body counts, convictions, and documented evidence. Their denial becomes willful rather than plausible. The hearing also highlighted how fragile institutional memory has become. The FBI, theoretically, doesn't forget. It has files, databases, case reports going back decades. But institutions are run by people. And if those people decide certain facts are better left unmentioned, the institution effectively forgets too. When political loyalty becomes more important than factual accuracy, when appointees are chosen for their willingness to advance a narrative rather than their expertise or integrity, you get situations like this, where the person at the top either genuinely doesn't know what he should know, or knows, but won't say it. Either possibility is terrifying. If Patel genuinely forgot about Dylan Roof and had to be reminded about El Paso, that suggests a stunning lack of preparation and awareness for someone in his position. If he knew, but chose to be vague, that suggests a deliberate strategy to downplay white supremacist violence for political reasons. Both scenarios undermine public confidence in the FBI's ability to protect Americans from domestic terrorism. Because if the director doesn't know or won't acknowledge the most significant threats, how can the agents under him effectively combat them? What signals does it send to field offices about priorities, about what gets resources and attention versus what gets quietly sidelined? The families of the victims in Charleston, Pittsburgh, El Paso, and Buffalo don't have the luxury of forgetting. Peg Durachko, who lost her husband Richard Gottfried in the Pittsburgh shooting, addressed the killer in court. "Your callous disregard for the person he was repulses me. Your hateful act took my soulmate." Barbara Massey, whose sister Catherine died in Buffalo, told Peyton Gendron, "I want to personally choke you and leave my fingers on your neck." Aye, these aren't abstract policy debates for them. They're permanent voids where loved ones used to be. They're holidays forever marked by absence. They're the knowledge that someone murdered their family member purely out of hate. And now that government agencies meant to prevent such attacks seem more concerned with political optics than actual prevention. Mark Talley, whose mother Geraldine died in Buffalo, said something profound after Gendron's sentencing. "At the end of the day, do I feel that this will cause change? Absolutely not. What would make me happy is if America could acknowledge its racism and racist history. That's the core of it, not just prosecuting individual killers after the fact, though that's necessary, but acknowledging the underlying disease that keeps producing them, acknowledging that the ideology didn't die with the Confederacy or end with the Civil Rights Act. It evolved, went online, found new recruits, and continues to inspire violence. Until that acknowledgement happens at the highest levels of government, until FBI directors can say plainly what the problem is without political calculation, the attacks will continue." Kamlager Dove's closing statement brought it all together. Evidence is agnostic. And your job? No one's job is to like the data or the evidence. It is to collect it. That is how you gain trust. She wasn't asking for agreement with a political position. She was asking for basic honesty about documented reality. For the FBI director to demonstrate that he understands the threats the Bureau is supposed to combat. for acknowledgement that white supremacist terrorism exists is deadly and requires resources and attention proportional to the danger it poses. The fact that such a request seems controversial, that it sparks pushback and evasion, tells you everything about how broken the conversation around domestic terrorism has become. Think about what it means when a congresswoman has to read the names of terror victims to the FBI director because he can't recall them himself. When she has to walk him through the deadliest attacks of the past decade because he either doesn't know them or won't acknowledge them. When she has to submit reports and studies and analyses into the congressional record because the normal institutional processes have failed. That's not oversight working as intended. That's oversight becoming necessary because the system itself has become unreliable, because political considerations have corrupted the basic function of keeping Americans safe. The stakes couldn't be higher. Every time a white supremacist commits a mass murder and the government response is muted or equivocal, it sends a message to other potential terrorists. You might get caught, but you won't be taken as seriously as other threats. You won't spark the same national conversation. Your ideology won't be named and condemned with the same force. You'll be called a lone wolf, mentally ill, an isolated case, not part of a movement that the government is actively working to dismantle. That implicit permission structure, that sense of tacit acceptance, contributes to the next attack. Because radicalization doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when vulnerable people encounter extremist content, when they're told their fears are legitimate, when they see others who acted on those beliefs either glorified online or inadequately condemned by authorities. Every hesitation, every evasion, every forgetful moment from people in power makes the next attack more likely. Sidney Kamlager Dove understood that. Her questioning wasn't performative. It was protective. She was trying to force accountability because accountability saves lives. When the FBI takes white supremacist terrorism seriously, dedicates resources to it, infiltrates those groups, monitors their forms, arrests people before they act, attacks get prevented. When the FBI prioritizes other threats or treats white supremacy as politically sensitive territory, people die. The hearing should haunt anyone who watched it, not because of any single moment of drama, though there was plenty of tension in the room, but because of what it revealed about the state of American institutions, about how easily truth can be obscured when it becomes inconvenient, about how difficult it is to have basic factual conversations when those facts implicate politically powerful people or contradict preferred narratives, about how the same names, Charleston, Pittsburgh, El Paso, Buffalo, have to be repeated over and over because we keep failing to learn the lesson they teach. That lesson is simple. Hate kills when left unchecked. Ideology matters. Words matter. The rhetoric that dehumanizes immigrants or minorities or religious groups creates the permission structure for violence. And when government officials refuse to acknowledge that connection, refuse to name the ideology, refuse to commit resources to the problem, they become complicit in what comes next. Kash Patel left that hearing without promising anything new, without committing to any specific actions to combat white supremacist terrorism, without even giving the full-throated acknowledgement that Sidney Kamlager Dove sought. He went back to running the FBI, presumably making the same political calculations, pleasing the same constituencies, avoiding the same uncomfortable truths. The families in Charleston and Pittsburgh and El Paso and Buffalo went back to their lives forever changed by loss. And somewhere in America, another young man was reading another manifesto, watching another video, preparing for another attack. The cycle continues because we let it, because we choose what to remember and what to forget, because we allow political expediency to override moral clarity, because we accept evasive answers from people who should be giving honest ones. If you believe evidence should matter more than politics, if you think the FBI director should know the names of the biggest domestic terror attacks on his watch, if you want institutions to actually protect people rather than protect narratives, then this hearing should make you angry. Not the performative social media kind of angry that fades by tomorrow, the sustained, focused kind of angry that demands change, that calls representatives, that votes based on who will actually confront these threats, that refuses to let the conversation shift away from uncomfortable truths just because they're uncomfortable. Charleston, Pittsburgh, El Paso, Buffalo. Say their names, remember their victims, understand what killed them, and demand that the people with the power to prevent the next tragedy actually do their jobs with honesty, with courage, with the recognition that American lives depend on them telling the truth.